If you try to please all, you please none. It's a quote by Aesop. Welcome, everybody, to this edition of Finding Your Feet After Failure. And it's my great pleasure tonight to invite Kyira Wackett. Hi, Kyira.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us. So, Kyira is a licensed mental health therapist. She specializes in shame resilience and radical acceptance through her platform, Adversity Rising. She empowers individuals with the insight, confidence, and skills to take charge of their narratives, from personalized coaching to corporate wellness. Kyira champions the anti-band-aid movement. I like that. Advocating for meaningful and lasting change over quick fixes. At the heart of her approach lies That Life AR, a renowned five-step therapeutic program. Through introspection and actionable strategies, Kyira guides participants through navigating life's challenges with grace and resilience. With Kyira Wackett by your side, you're not just rewriting your story, you're reclaiming your narrative, embracing adversity, and charting a course towards profound fulfillment. Kyira, what is That Life AR?
I think about every time my daughter is 4.5, is constantly doing this right now. She'll see something that looks different from her life or something that looks more fun. And she's like, I want that. I want that. And so when people talk about the lives that they want to lead, they say a lot of times, well, I want that in my life. I want that life. I want those things. And so when I was thinking about how to design a program for people, it just kept coming back to that statement. I want that life. And so this program that I created was this idea of all the work that I do in the therapy room with a client, everything, if I were to break it down, what is the process of healing? What is the process of moving, balancing insight and action? All of that is the work that we're doing to try to get whatever that life is for us. And it's contextual, it's iterative, it changes all the time. But it's this notion of, can I give people the roadmap or the tools, and then they put the work in to secure that? So when they say that, it's they are getting everything they need to have that life. And then the slash AR is just how to make it so it's connected back to adversity rising. But I think that's the key to get to that point where we stop saying, oh, I want this, I want this, I wish I could have this. Why can't I have this? And going, I have that. I have that life because I worked really hard to get to that place. And I have the skills and tools that I need to constantly give myself that life when who I am, what I need, or the context of my life changes.
Great. So to get that life, people have little mistakes and accidents and falls on the way. We don't just get there. Sometimes we work very hard to get there. Sometimes it might be plain sailing, but we all do make mistakes and we do have failures along the way.
Mhm.
Can you share a failure that you may have experienced in your life?
I think a lot about when I'm deep in my shame, I could give you 1,000,007 failures, every little misstep that I take. Even I think about I had a workout class this morning and I had to lower my weight in what I was doing with a certain move. And my brain at that point would have said, well, that's a failure because you were supposed to do this, you were supposed to do these things. So much about the standards that I had were around perfection. As I've done the work to kind of understand shame resilience and what that looks like to be in the process of recognizing that my brain's always going to give me those invitations to say that I'm not enough, I'm failing, I am constantly one step away from being lovable and worthy. I recognize now that quote unquote failure to me are the big ticket invitations I have about how I can move forward. So I would say one of my biggest failures that is now my biggest opportunity was that I would spend my days and my time constantly trying to be everything that everybody else needed or wanted in their life to make them okay at my own expense. And so it was a lot of my whole sense of self was defined by being the person that could do everything for everyone else and to never be asked, how are you? To never need for anything. And that was probably at least a decade of my adult life spent on doing that before I realized, oh my gosh, I'm by doing this, I'm not only failing myself in that sense because I'm not living authentically to me, but I'm not allowing our relationship to be anything other than me taking care of people. And so that's been a really, really big opportunity for me to learn, where did that come from? Why did I do it? Why do I still want to do it sometimes? And what does it look like to develop a more successful relationship with myself and with other people as I move forward?
So if other people find themselves at that crossroads, what advice do you give them?
I think that oftentimes people have to reach a point. I wish this wasn't true. I wish that we felt that we were allowed to do the work until we reach some big pain point that feels like the world is sort of ending for us. But it seems like the way that we've designed our system is that we have to keep going until we reach such a deep space of burnout that we can't get out of it without some sort of support on the outside. And so a lot of the times when people are coming to me, they're at that place of, I just can't do this anymore. I'm too overwhelmed. Everything is terrible. And so I think oftentimes the crossroads is a place of desperation. I need to fix it. I need to fix it now. I need the pain to stop. And so a lot of that is still rooted back into this idea of, I live in the United States. I can really only speak to what it's like being in the US. I also know this isn't specific to just living here. The hustle culture that we exist in, that's been perpetuated by technology, social media, it's that we're always supposed to be doing. And when you are burnt out, when you do have some, again, misstep, failure, whatever you want to call it, it's fix it as quickly as possible and get back on track. So the first thing I really like to tell people is that's great that you're recognizing you feel this way. And our job right now isn't to fix it. Our job is to feel it. Our job is to recognize what that looks like to experience this. What are the fears? What are the anxieties, the worries, the stories that you've been holding on to? If we were to say everything is terrible right now and I can't fix it in a day, what is your biggest concern would happen? And for a lot of people, it's that sense of worthiness that if I'm not doing, if I'm not achieving, if I'm not succeeding, moving at all times, my worth and value goes away. And so the initial part of the work with anyone I do is recognizing what that looks like, to be willing to be vulnerable enough to step back from that and to say, look, I mean, I don't know if you looked up wellness and like the top bestsellers list or anything. Like there are books everywhere that'll keep giving you band-aids to feel a little bit better, to continue to feel like you can do it. And you're just going to end up right back here. It's not working. What would it look like to either continue in this predictably crappy cycle of living where you come back here every time, or you allow the possibility that something could look different? And I guess maybe the core lesson to say to anybody at that point is that you can't actually heal and move forward if you're not willing to turn and face whatever's going on internal. This isn't a problem to fix so you can get back on track. Your sense of longing, your pain, your fears, they're invitations to dive deeper and to realize how much you've likely been in survival mode your whole life, and what that looks like to start to rewire our brain's patterns to not assume that we owe people everything or that we have to achieve at a certain level to be worthy of love and security in our lives.
So what are the first steps that we should take to turn and face it?
I think a lot about when people come to this place, they're pretty good at saying what their pain is on the surface. I hate my job. I don't have money. I'm divorced. I've lost this, whatever those things are. They're pretty good at the surface spot. And so I think one of the first things is just to give more space to that. I call it a brain dump, and to just list what is everything that your brain is holding on to right now that you are now trying to task yourself to fix in one sitting or by reading one or two books, and getting a feel for that. And then we need to go a step deeper in that process. We can all complain that things aren't good enough. That's a perspective shift, but we really need to understand why there's a risk, a fear, something that is associated with whatever's going on. So there's, kind of the main sides of, well, if I don't have a job, I'm not making money, I can't pay my bills, I'm going to be without a house, or, some of those things. But there's something deeper. What does that mean if you're not earning money at a certain level? What does that mean if you lost your job? What does that mean if your marriage, quote unquote, failed and it's no longer a part of your life? And helping people to really develop the insight that the meaning that their fear is kind of getting its energy from is typically the idea of, well, that's a threat to my worth and value. This is what you're supposed to do. I've been given a checkbox. These are the things I'm supposed to cross off, and I didn't do it. And so a lot of the initial piece is kind of going in and out of the sort of deep emotional awareness of not just what do you have pain around, but why? Why is that a pain point for you? Why is it problematic? And then starting to build some context into understanding how that got to that place. And so for the clients that I work with, we're talking specifically about shame or the fear of not being good enough, not being worthy, not belonging in some way. And so we go back and we look at from the time that they were young, seeing that love was often conditional. You got good grades and you were treated differently than kids that didn't get good grades. You were obedient with your parents, you were treated differently than when you broke the rules or didn't listen. And so you started to develop this idea that our acceptance, our love is based on meeting a set of conditions. And then we take it and we amplify it and we get to today. How did that happen? How did that become the rule book that you're under? And what does that look like to start to shift that? And so there's these real things that we might have to address. If there are these fears of, paying their bills, doing these things, but for most people, that's not actually the thing they're most afraid of. For most people, it is that whatever has happened will become synonymous with how people think about them. They're more afraid of what someone else is going to think, that they don't have a job or they have to go on food stamps or that their marriage isn't there, than they are actually worried about the like physical list of things that need to be done. How do I pay my bills? It's, gosh, what are people going to think? And when we can get to that point and we can hone in on the shame and where that comes from, then we can start to rewrite a story that puts them in the driver's seat and still addresses there's real problems. We're always going to have pain points we have to take care of, but not through the lens of really giving top billing to what everybody else thinks or how much they do or don't approve of what we do.
And how long does it take for somebody to come to that point where they, excuse me, where they can overcome that emotion, that fear, that failure?
Yeah. I think that's really why when shame took over, so gosh, this would have been what, 2017, 2018, when I feel like I watched, Brene Brown's talk got really big. Everyone started talking about shame. We had a lot more conversation about shame, about control, about acceptance that was starting to come out. But people still kind of just talked about it without really understanding what do we do with it long term. And so the reality is, if anyone's ever seen Inside Out, there's emotions in our brain. Our job is not to conquer those emotions. People talk about conquering fear all the time. That's not the goal. The goal is to learn how to work with a very helpful and adaptive response in your brain and body and not give it so much power that it goes to the unhelpful or maladaptive response. So for most of us, shame is actually a very normal thing we're going to have. I'm going to have those little thoughts, little things like I can hear on a quiet level right now. Are you articulate enough? Are you taking up too much space? Are you saying anything that's helpful for people? You're always going to have a little bit of that storyline. But really, what we think about is our goal is to develop resilience to say, when that happens, this is how I show up, not here's how I'm going to make sure it never happens again. Because if we didn't have those things, we wouldn't have those checks of how am I feeling? How am I doing? And so, for a lot of people, I would say, when we talk about sort of psychological healing, you spent decades likely building the narrative that you have now that's getting in the way of you living your best life. So for many people, they're like, well, if I come to a couple sessions, it's going to be fine. I only need to go to therapy for like a month or two, right? So a lot of the conversations that I have is that most of this is going to take at least 6 months or a year to unravel. Everybody's different. A lot of that depends on how much resistance you have in the beginning to the process, and then how much sort of complex trauma or wounds do we have to sort through as we go through it. But I tell people at a minimum, if you're suddenly like, I feel better in less than 6 months and everything is amazing, you somehow bamboozled yourself or been bamboozled by someone else. It just won't happen. And so I think sort of recognizing the goal isn't, well, I'm going to get to this point in 1 year and everything's going to be great. Part of the acceptance point is to say, I don't know how long it's going to take me, but I'm willing to show up every day and keep taking the next step because I know on some level, moving there, the sort of collective experience of those steps is going to feel better than this feels right now, as I've walked in a circle over and over again that just leaves me in more pain.
What about the little failures, the little mistakes? Somebody hires the wrong person or fires the wrong person, or somebody uh, tells a white lie to somebody
Mhm.
that has some ramifications. How do you deal with those failures?
I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to, for many of us that struggle, there's sort of two scopes given the examples you gave. So, one, I think recognizing our relationship with perfection. Many of us have these expectations of ourselves that we are going to be able to always know the right answer and do the right thing. That usually comes from a place of love having been conditional for us, again, as kids. As young adults, you have to achieve at this level, and that's how you earn appraisal, a love, whatever it is. So we have these standards that we can somehow be perfect. We can be something for everybody. And I think those perfection standards lead us to things like, well, gosh, I should have never hired that person. I should have known that that was going to be a problem. I should have foreseen this thing that would have happened. So we punish ourselves with data that we didn't have at the time we made the choice. And we have a really hard time seeing life in context. I might be wiser now because somebody shared another layer of themselves. And now I actually see that they were the wrong fit for a company or the wrong fit to work for X, Y, and Z. At the time, we made the best choice possible with the energy, resources, and information available to us in that moment. So it's recognizing sort of the context of I might make a different choice now. The choice I made then felt like the right choice in the moment. And so instead of it being about, well, you should know all the right answers, it's knowing right is a subjective interpretation that changes with information and context every day. And so I think that's sort of one part of realizing you're going to screw up, and from sort of a radical acceptance standpoint, which is learning to control what you can control, you can't control how other people present themselves. You can't control whether or not the way that they present themselves allows you to see what's underneath or doesn't. You can't control that things are going to happen outside of your scope of practice. I think about a lot of companies coming out of the pandemic. We're seeing major layoffs in these global companies all throughout the world. They didn't go into the pandemic thinking this was going to happen. Every day they structured their company to the best they could. This major thing happened they couldn't control, and now they're trying to respond the best way they know how. They might have done it differently if they were given a heads up of, hey, you're going to have a global pandemic that's going to affect your sales for the next 4 years. You might want to think ahead. So being really intentional about not giving ourselves responsibility, but also not thinking so much of ourselves that we think that we're that powerful that we can exist without making mistake. And the second thing that you said that I think is key is recognizing things like the white lies or the little things where maybe we're conscious of the decisions we're making and those don't sit right with us. Those are super important to ask ourselves. Typically, we're feeling guilty or we feel some like discomfort about whatever those choices are, whatever those missteps might be, but we do them anyways. Typically, there's some storyline of self perseverance. So I think about even the smallest thing, like somebody having something in their teeth and not telling them. I see this. I am not telling them that it's there. I'm not telling them because I don't want them to know there's something in their teeth. I am so afraid that I'm going to be the cause of their embarrassment that it's about protecting my own discomfort that I don't say anything. So the second side of it is now not just the perfection side, but our own inability to deal with our own distress or the potential idea that we could cause distress to someone else. And I think that leads to a sense of preservation that again sort of keeps us stuck in these cycles where we don't trust in our ability or other people's ability to be vulnerable or to have something not go a certain way.
So those little mistakes, those little missteps, as you put it, how do you deal with that? I've just made that mistake. I've made that decision. It
Yep.
was the wrong decision. How do I deal with it?
I mean, I think that there are two key elements of it. So, one, a lot of the times people talk about self care and self love as a reaction to when they feel burnt out or overwhelmed. And so, if you don't have a practice of trying to show yourself grace and compassion coming into a big step like this, it's really hard to be like, well, just show kindness to yourself. Be graceful with yourself. Everyone makes a difficult choice. So, while that is actually one of the most important things, I think just saying it to anyone listening, it's really hard to just bring it in at that point. So, one of the things that you can do if you're not in those positions is to start to develop a daily practice of celebrating the imperfections of the self. So, something you might want to do differently, something you learned, but also something that was a win, and starting to practice some gratitude for that process of humanity. Then, in those moments when something happens, we're able to be a little bit more compassionate with ourselves. Couple of the things that I think about in those moments, though, is again, if we go back to distress tolerance, most often we really struggle with our own discomfort. We do not know how to deal with our distress. And so we try to cope with it in often maladaptive ways. Sometimes it's trying to make up for this deficiency, trying to, let's say that you missed a deadline at work and you're feeling really bad about it, or you didn't get somebody something they needed. Now you're going to work 80 hours a week instead of 40 to try to make up for that so that people know that you really want to be on the team. Well, when you're doing that to try to protect against your own shame and discomfort because you cannot allow the possibility that someone might perceive you this certain way. So that drive is basically to undo whatever this thing is that you're afraid is going to exist out in the world. One of the elements of distress tolerance is to be able to let go of what happened, to take radical responsibility for it. Maybe saying, hey, I missed a deadline. I'm really sorry about that. Or, gosh, I realized that my communication skills around this were not where they needed to be. Next time, this is how I want to approach it, and integrate into that what we can learn, but then not going down a hole of self-punishment and flagellation. Because ultimately, all that's doing is making it about you. It's not making it about the other person, and it's not building sustainable buy-in for you or whatever else you're doing. So learning how to tolerate the distress of, gosh, I screwed up and I can't just make this feeling go away. Again, thinking about my 4.5-year-old, when she does something she doesn't feel good about, she wants me to make her feel better. And we have a lot of conversations of, this is actually really healthy that you don't feel good about this right now. It tells you that you have some guilt, which guilt is different from shame. It means I did something I don't like and I can decide what I want to do with that information. So then you ask yourself that and you say, well, what can I take with me? What can I take here? But the key being, what did I learn? How can I shift my behavior? And how do I also see that who I was in that moment is not a bad person? So that's the difference between shame and guilt is you are bad versus I did something that doesn't feel good. And I think that's the big step for us when it comes to failures, to lies, whether it's a conscious decision to do something wrong and hurtful or a misstep where we did something unintentionally wrong and hurtful, recognizing that we as a person are more than our worst day or a small collection of mistakes that we made, but instead saying the best thing I can do for myself, but also for other people, is to not let my ego make it all about me as a person and instead say, what can I learn so I can show up better the next time? And that's a really hard thing. And that's where, again, if we circle back to the self-care, that's what can come into play with that. We're not saying we didn't screw up. We're saying, I'm not going to be defined by this screw up. And if I give this screw up the pen to write my story, then I'm either going to constantly be in a position I'm going to do those things because I'm going to be too burnt out and overwhelmed to think of anything other than that. And I create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or everything I do is going to be about trying to make people not think that about me. And then what I'm doing is really about serving my ego and not about serving the collective or my values in any real way.
I'm not going to be defined by that screw up. That's a very good statement. You coined the phrase, you can never please everybody. What do you mean by that?
I've been thinking a lot about this quote by Bruce Lee, where I'm going to get it wrong probably a little bit, but this idea that essentially he says, I'm not in this life or in this world to meet everybody else's expectations, and they're not here to meet all of mine. And I think sometimes when we try to make it so that we can meet everybody else's expectations, all we're doing is putting on different masks of performance to try to match everybody else's storylines. And so when you try to do that, and I have done this, I've done it in my business practice, I've done this with friendships, with family, what ends up happening is you lose your authentic voice. You lose what you have to say, and you're performing because what you've decided is that their approval of you is more important than their acknowledgement of your true self. So your relationships are incredibly lonely and they're resentful. You become scared to be honest and authentic. And so for me, I think a lot about the fact that, gosh, if I'm going to say something, if I'm going to use my voice, my platform, whether it's on my YouTube channel, my podcast, if I'm doing speaking events, I can't please everyone. And the reality is that I have opinions and thoughts and ideas, and I don't want to exist in sort of the cult of the average. And so if I'm going to be seen, if I'm going to allow my voice to be heard, I have to accept that some people aren't going to like me. And that's going to trigger my shame because my shame believes that I should be liked and celebrated by everyone because that's that perfection piece. that that's somehow attainable and you have to spend your whole life chasing that. And if somebody doesn't like me, gosh, then my whole focus has to be making sure that they like me and they approve of me. But that's a distraction from saying, I'm okay if not everybody likes me. I don't like everyone. That also doesn't mean that I hate those people or I'm spending all of my energy trying to bring them down. It's just saying there are too many people in this world for us all to know and like each other. It's okay that we have differences. And so I think a big part of it is also recognizing a degree of tolerance that everyone can exist and have a voice. But the root underneath that that's so scary is that everyone deserves to be seen and loved. And if you spent your life believing that you are only lovable if, it's really hard for those two statements to exist in that space. And so I can often see it for other people. I can show love and kindness to other people, even if they do something quote unquote wrong or have a misstep or have a different opinion. But I have to be able to bring that to me too. And so I remind myself that every day, that I have to be willing to be bold enough, to be vulnerable enough to have an opinion, to say something, and to release the fact that I cannot control whether or not somebody likes me or how quote unquote successful I'm going to be based on external validation. I can just control that I have a voice and I know that I want to use it connected to my values and the drive to put goodness in the world. And that's all I can control.
And trying to please everybody, you're bound to make those mistakes
Right.
because
Absolutely.
we are all different. So one needs to realize that we've got to keep our authenticity and our vulnerability.
Right.
Because as Aesop said, if you try to please all, you please none.
Hmm.
What final tips could you give our viewers if they find themselves suffering from a mistake, suffering from a failure, and they have that shame or they have that guilt? Just something to help them cope in the moment with that feeling.
I think the two things you could decide which lands for you more. The first is recognizing if the response you have would be the same response you'd have if it was someone else. If your best friend had had this happen, made this mistake, would you have the same intense reaction, response towards them, judgment of them as a person? If it's not a universal reaction, there's something about it that's rooted to your shame story, and your shame and your ego are very enmeshed. So, recognizing that by holding on to that, we're giving more power to our ego instead of recognizing I'm a human, just like they're a human, and I'm going to have a more appropriate, balanced response, similar to what I would do with someone else. So, I think that first part is saying, gosh, is my reaction the same way I would be with someone else? And if not, what does that look like to put it more in line with how I would respond to a best friend, to a partner, to my child? The second thing that I think a lot about is so the concept of radical acceptance, again, is controlling what you can control and learning to let go of the rest. What's happened in your past is out of your control. What is in your control are the beliefs that you tie or tether to that experience and how long you spend staring in the mirror back at what happened. Because the reality is, the more time that you spend stuck there, the less likely that you're going to make positive changes in the present or the future self as well. Your whole story is going to become tethered to those things. And that doesn't serve you or anyone else. And so recognizing that happened, you can't control it. Maybe you need to grieve it. Maybe you need to feel it. Maybe you need to go there, fine. Process the emotion, but you are making a conscious choice if you're going to stall your story there because you do have control over that. And so if you want that to be your biggest, most defining moment, keep spending time there. If you don't want that to be your biggest, most defining moment, then ask yourself what it looks like to let that go. And again, if you can process it and take with you what's important, what's helpful from it, and then ask yourself how you can use that information now in your present, which is the only time in your life you can control, to become a version of yourself that has evolved past that mistake.
And what do you think about self-forgiveness?
I think it's the most important tool that we have. And I think people struggle with forgiveness because they think it means I'm saying everything's fine, nothing happened, it doesn't count, we're all okay. It's not a dismissal of what happened. It's saying what happened happened. Now, how am I going to move forward? It's expanding your scope outside of that one thing or that collection of things. And so oftentimes self-forgiveness is way harder than forgiveness of other people. So I think a lot of times if we can practice forgiveness towards others first, it's recognizing that it's a gift to say, I'm going to see that you are worth more than that, or that honestly, I am worth more than the wrongdoing someone did to me. Maybe somebody did cut you off in traffic. Maybe somebody did really hurt you in your life. They were abusive, they were hurtful, they were harmful. You are worth more than how that person treated you or that experience. And if you can turn it towards self forgiveness, it's recognizing, again, go back to context. You are doing the best you can every day with the information and energy available to you. And when we are burnt out and in a state of trauma or hypervigilance or reactivity, it is incredibly difficult to make a decision that we're not going to feel some sort of shame around because our body is just trying to get through a moment. And most of us are in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and we are just learning emotional intelligence for the first time. So giving ourselves a little bit of grace to realize, how can I punish myself for something that I didn't know at the time? You did it when you didn't have the information, skills, resources, insight, whatever it was. So punishing yourself for it is not going to serve you. And again, just kind of keeps you back and stuck in your ego. So it's coming to, you're going to screw up. You're a human. You're not meant to be perfect. You're going to hurt people. You're going to disappoint them. You're going to let them down. They're going to do the same for you. It's recommitting to the values that you have and the choices you want to make that are a connection to your values instead of coming from that shame lens of saying, well, it's perfection or nothing. I'm either perfect or I'm terrible. And that black and white zone is what's going to keep you stuck in that cycle and unable to move forward.
Oh, well, there's a lot that you've shared with us today. Uh, how can people reach you, Kyira?
I think the best place would be just to go to my website. So adversityrising.com. There's links there that you can go to my podcast, go to my YouTube channel, learn about some of the different programs or free resources that I have available for people. And it's also the best place to just say connect and shoot me an email because I'm the only person that's in there. So I'll be able to see that, respond to you, and get connected and answer questions that people might have.
Fantastic. I think I'll have to give you a call. So thank you so much for sharing that. Any final words for our viewers?
I think just remembering that if anything is quick, it probably wasn't meaningful. And so if you're going to really do this work, it's accepting the fact that this is going to take a lot of time. And I think we've all heard that it's going to feel worse before it feels better. It's not that it feels worse. It's that you're slowing yourself down enough to actually feel the feelings that you've spent your entire life trying to outrun. And that feels really hard and overwhelming. But the reality is that outrunning them has just made them last an exorbitantly a long amount of time. Once you turn and face them for a moment, it will feel much more intense, but they're much more short-lived. They're transient. We can move through the process. And so acknowledging that this is going to take time, there's no such thing as a quick fix, no matter how many New York Times bestseller books you buy that try to promise and guarantee that it will not happen. It is a slow build with a lot of pain that goes into it. And the really beautiful thing when you take that approach is you start to build your capacity to recognize you can actually do those hard things. And you build a sustainable buy into yourself where down the road, you don't need therapy all the time. You don't need to buy all the next books. You've done the work to really develop and harness those skills inside of you so you feel more equipped to have that life when you get to that place.
Fabulous. So everybody, please do contact Kyira, and you can also contact me. I'll put both the links down in the description below. You can contact me for some discussions on the first steps you can take towards finding your feet after failure. Please do subscribe to the channel, and please do watch the various videos that we have. There's a lot of information, a lot of learning, a lot of insights. Thank you, Kyira, so much for joining us today.
Thank you.